I'm so impressed by your story. Like
Thank
start to
you.
not even finish, but where you are. You've been on so many journeys. And one of the things is you were diagnosed with autism as an adult.
Yes.
How old were you when you received your diagnosis?
Oh my gosh, it was only 4 years ago, so I was already 42. So I've been living my whole life with it and everything, but now I understand myself better, so I'm so happy I went and got the diagnosis.
What made you think to go down that route of like, let me see if something's going on, like let me just check in?
I always knew I had certain social difficulties and difficulties relating to people, and I would always make all kinds of excuses for it. Like maybe it's because I grew up in a really, really remote place in Alaska, basically like almost off the grid. So I always kind of blamed it on blamed it on that, even though my sister didn't really seem to be worse off for it. So that didn't really make sense. But my mom was talking about it to my ex-husband and saying that she had suspected when I was little that something was going on and that, as time went on, she thought, it was Asperger's as they called it then. And I started to look into what that was and what some of the symptoms of it were and some of the signs. And I thought, wow, this really sounds like me. And I was very curious about it and finally found somebody who did adult diagnoses. And I did a series, I think it was a series of like 7 appointments with
Wow.
the doctor to figure it out and get the diagnosis.
Wow. So when you received the diagnosis, what was going through your head? Was it like relief? Were you shocked? What was kind of happening for you?
It was definitely relief at that point because I'd been turned on to the idea for a couple years at that point, and I'd been doing a lot of research and coming across a lot of creators on social media who were dealing with the same thing, which is always helpful. So it was nice to be able to know, and I felt like if this was something I was going to talk about publicly, I had a responsibility to, get the diagnosis and see for sure if that's what it was or not. So.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a lot to process, even if you had your suspicions. Did any part of you consider not sharing this publicly, or were you always like, this is my platform and I'm gonna speak about this?
What's weird is I feel like I should be a private person. Like I feel like that's kind of like my temperament, but it's just hasn't gone that way in my adult life. Like I've always kind of been attracted to like these experiences I wanted to do that kind of required you to put yourself in the public eye. And, I had, some experiences with the downsides of being in the public eye as anybody would. And after I had my kids, I went through this phase where I was a complete hermit. I just wanted to like write fiction under an assumed name. I didn't want to do anything else publicly. I just went through this phase where I was completely over it. And then when COVID hit, I was, other than trying to homeschool the kids and kind of failing at that, I did it. But other than that, I was bored and like, what can I do that's productive? So I started a TikTok, I started a YouTube, and just got really comfortable sharing with people and just felt like that was my journey and that there's going to be something, further down the road or, you know, later on where that kind of exposure will come into play and, I can help people or do something with that because it's just what I felt drawn to in a way, even though part of me is very private. So I just kind of got used to like being really transparent with my audience and not hiding anything. I am very private about my kids, but that's about it. Everything else is pretty much fair game. And I remember I first talked about, this was before I had my formal diagnosis, but I was first talking about suspecting I was on the spectrum when I did my first Call Her Daddy interview in 2021, because I really felt like it played into my story. I was just kind of telling my story about coming to LA and getting involved with Playboy and like falling in love with a much older man. And I feel like having the difficulty I did connecting with people for so long made me feel like when I, was meeting somebody who was like older and more experienced and maybe a little bit better at manipulating people, I thought, oh, wow, maybe I'm meant to be with an older man. Maybe this is what it is. It just like felt like love. And I think maybe I wouldn't have thought that, or maybe I would have handled myself a little differently had I known what I was dealing with myself and, been able to address my social skills better and things like that. I don't have any regrets about where my life took me, but I do think it's an interesting piece of my story for sure. And it definitely kind of, I think, sheds some light on, where my feelings were at and my motivations and why I had certain impressions about things. I just think it's an interesting part of the whole journey.
To look back on such a monumental experience in your life and be able to have a different perspective on it, knowing what you know now is just like mind blowing and very impressive. Did you tell your kids about your diagnosis? And if so, how did you relay that information to them?
Their dad actually did because
Oh,
one
interesting.
day my daughter came up to me and she goes, Mom, I know you're autistic, but I still love you, which sounds so funny, but like she's a little kid, so
That's
that's
so sweet.
so cute.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And what an awesome little girl you're raising, you
Yeah,
know?
she's so sweet. I mean, I really didn't have to do anything. Like it was when I was getting the diagnosis, their dad kind of took the initiative and like, told them what that was and bought them some books and told them there might be some kids at your school or some kids you meet that have this and this is what your mom's dealing with. So,
Yeah. Wow. You have an awesome partner,
thank you.
co-parent.
Yeah.
That's very
Yeah, for
cool.
sure. That was actually when I was getting my diagnosis, I was talking to the doctor, she was like, "What do you want to get out of this?" And I'm like, "Well, like I'm at that time I was 42. I'm like, I'm 42. Like I've lived my whole life like this. I feel like I'm pretty comfortable with who I am, but I just want to know that what I'm dealing with isn't affecting my parenting because sometimes being on the spectrum, not only can you have social difficulties, but you can have difficulties expressing emotions the way a neurotypical person would. So I just wanted to make sure, and I wanted the help of her, and I wanted the help of my ex-husband and everybody around us. If you notice anything, let me know if I'm not being as expressive as I could be. And everybody's just really helpful with that.
Wow. That's phenomenal. You have such a support system and
Yeah, for sure.
but you advocated for that, So I think that's, kudos to you again. Like I said, you spoke about having or experiencing body dysmorphia,
Mhm.
that I'm sure a lot of women, young women can relate to, but you obviously were in a much more specific situation. You were on a pedestal for the entire world. Um, how did you heal from that situation?
I don't know that I'm healed from that, honestly. I'm just more skewed toward a health. Like I'm super into anything health, biohacking, things like that. So I really focus on that and try not to focus so much on like the appearance of it all or, I mean, they say it's not healthy to like be on a scale, but I have to admit I get on a scale regularly because I do have dysmorphia. So there's a part of me that's like, no, I need to see something that's like a little bit more subjective and tells me what I weigh because I can't trust my own judgment. It's not probably what other people would think is like the healthiest part of my personality, but looking at where I came from, I don't think anybody could really expect it to be any different. But also like it's in a way though, it's also not that deep too. Like taking care of my appearance and looking a certain way and wearing certain clothes, that's almost like a hobby for me. I'm not really doing it for anybody else at this point.
Yeah. And I think that's so empowering. It
Thanks.
really is. And unfortunately, I can relate to a lot of what you're describing. I've had my experiences with body dysmorphia and eating
Yeah.
disorders and all that. So I really can relate. And I wanted to sort of ask, how do you tune that out specifically with regard to raising a daughter?
Oh, I made a decision really early on that I didn't want my daughter to fall into any of the traps that I fell into. So I have never spoken about diet or anything like that or weight or anything in front of her. If I'm trying to talk about like not eating sweets or eating healthier, I just talk about that for, health's sake and approach it from a health perspective. I don't want her falling into any of like the over obsession with appearance. And I think me and her dad have been pretty good at like filtering that out.
Yeah. Wow, good. That's amazing. I asked, honestly, I was like just from a personal level, I was very curious because I'm sure it's, obviously boys and men can experience body dysmorphia too. But I think there's just the societal pressures on women are on another level.
Yeah, it still creeps in for sure. Like I'll catch her saying something like, "Oh, how do I get rid of my belly?" And I'm like, First of all, no, you don't need to. And second of all, you're 12 and that's what you're supposed to look like."